Good morning and welcome to our third webinar in CClear's 5th annual New York State Virtual Redevelopment Summit. We're so glad that you could join us today for What's Bright in New York, the Renewable Energy Pathway. I hope that some of you have listened to our other webinars that we've had in this summit week, including our land banking webinar and our placemaking webinar on Tuesday and Wednesday. If you have not viewed those, you can look in your email. You were sent recordings. So many of you have probably heard this at this point, so I'm going to be very brief. If you haven't, we are the Center for Creative Land Recycling. Our mission is to promote the sustainable, equitable, and responsible reuse of underutilized and environmentally impacted properties. We educate, advocate, assist, and convene stakeholders to revitalize communities through land recycling. We are also EPA's technical assistance to brownfields provider, or TAB provider, for 10 states and territories around the country, including New York. I won't stay on this slide long, but I just want to sum up that we provide one-on-one technical assistance, host national webinars, convene workshops and conferences like this one, usually they're in person, and disseminate newsletters and online resources having to do with land reuse and redevelopment. This webinar is accredited, and I want to give a special shout out and thank you to the American Planning Association's Upstate New York chapter for assisting us in accrediting this webinar and other webinars in this summit. AICP certified planners who complete this webinar can receive 1.25 certification maintenance credits. The code is on the screen there. This slide deck is on your dashboard under the handouts tab, so you can download the complete deck, and all the information that we go over today will be there. AICP members should report their credits the same way they would for a live event through your APA CM log. A couple little housekeeping and webinar format notes. This webinar does include visuals. Speakers will present for about 45 minutes, and then we'll engage in some discussion and Q&A for the remaining time. You are going to receive a recording of this webinar about 4 hours after the webinar concludes, and that is going to be going to all registrants. And then we appreciate your feedback. So there is a survey that will launch immediately after this webinar. Please fill that out. We really appreciate your feedback and input. There's a number of engagement opportunities involved with this webinar. So to ask a question, type in the lower box of your dashboard. All participants will see, or you can mark it to send it to the moderators only. If we don't get to your questions, I do encourage you either way to utilize the Summit exclusive LinkedIn group. You can pose questions there and tag speakers to keep the conversation going. We will also be conducting a couple live polls in this webinar, so participate in those, and then you're welcome to expand on your answers in the LinkedIn group. If you will pose a question that we are unable to address, we can either address it in the LinkedIn group, or we can respond to it next week and get back to you, which we do plan to do. All right, at this time I want to give a thank you to our wonderful sponsors. This whole summit wouldn't be possible without them, and we really thank them for sticking with us as we converted this to an online format. It was not an easy task, and their support meant everything. So, and now I'd like to hand it off to one of our sponsors from Labella, Mark Greger.
Thank you, Claire. Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to help introduce today's webinar. And I'm fortunate to work with Jean and Claire as a CClear Advisory Board member as well. Just a little bit of background about me. I worked for the City of Rochester for 32 years in a brownfield focused career prior to joining Labella Associates in 2017, where I work as the manager of municipal environmental programs. Labella is a proud sponsor of CClear and also of this virtual summit, and we would encourage others to help support CClear as well if you're able to do that. There will be a little bit of a video on Labella to introduce you to our services and our company. Before that, I wanted to mention that we're a growing company and we have offices all across New York State. And for those of you in the Capital District, recently Aztec Environmental Technologies joined Labella out of their Ballston office. So I think, you know, before we jump to the video, I just want to thank Claire for helping to organize this webinar, and I hope you all enjoy it and appreciate your attendance. Thanks, Claire.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. I'm going to go ahead and show the video now.
Our clients can look to us as a trusted advisor. Listen, see things from their side of the table. Their success is our success.
We are stewards of the companies and the clients' resources.
It's really a testament to the quality of people we have, the energy they bring.
We have the same values and the same culture that we had when we had 8 people, and now we have 650 people. At Labella, we are powered by partnership.
Okay, excellent. So thank you again, Mark, for that introduction to Labella. Okay, at this time, before I hand things off to our moderator, I am going to conduct a couple polls, so you can please participate in those. So I'm going to launch the first poll here. The first poll is, how familiar are you with the following clean energy programs? The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, otherwise known as CLCPA, and the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act. I've had to use the acronyms because not enough characters. So 1, I am not familiar with these programs. 2, I am somewhat familiar but have only a basic understanding. Or 3, I am familiar with these programs and am seeking the latest updates. Okay, excellent. The votes are rolling in. Right, excellent, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So it looks like the majority of you are not familiar with these programs. So that's fine, because we're going to talk about them. About a third of you are somewhat familiar, but only a basic understanding, and then a few of you are familiar and seeking the latest updates. Okay, I'm going to share the next poll here. Let's see. The next poll is, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act mandates that 70% of the state's electricity must come from renewable energy by 2030. What do you think we're at now? Less than 15, between 15 and 30, between 30 and 50, or greater than 50%? Excellent, so those votes are rolling in. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to give everyone just another moment to vote. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this poll, share the results. So you all did pretty well. The answer is 26.8%. So you can see that more than half of you actually selected the correct bracket. So I'd love to hear your thoughts behind why you chose the option you chose in the LinkedIn group. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hide that poll. Excellent. Okay, and now I'm going to hand it off to our wonderful moderator, Jennifer Phelps, the Senior Project Manager for the Build Ready program at NYSERDA.
Hi, good morning. My name is Jennifer Phelps. I'm a Senior Project Manager on the Large Scale Renewables team at NYSERDA, and welcome everyone who's on the webinar. I'm currently focusing most of my time on the new Build Ready program at NYSERDA, but in addition to myself, you'll hear from a wonderful panel today. Kathy Spencer is Labella's Principal Environmental Analyst with over 30 years of experience in environmental analysis and compliance. In the last several years, Kathy has become involved in 3 Article 10 wind energy projects and has become a sought-after resource for her experience with renewable energy projects. Mark Reisler is a principal at Science Paget. Mark regularly works on solar, storage, wind, geothermal, and renewable natural gas project financings, representing lenders and borrowers. He also works on securitizations of residential solar and rural small wind assets. Next slide. William Aiello is the mayor of the city of Olean. Mayor Aiello served a 32-year career with the City of Olean Police Department and retired with the rank of captain. He was elected mayor of the City of Olean in 2013 and was re-elected to the position in 2017. Wynonna Noni Flynn has worked in finance for more than 40 years, including the last 11 in municipal government. She has worked for Yates County since 2012. In her position as county administrator for Yates County, Noni has worked to expand public service to every area of the county, working with others to make Yates County a wonderful place to live for all. And Paul Coran is the founder and managing director at BQ Energy, a renewable energy development firm that specializes in siting wind and solar projects on landfills and brownfield sites. Paul and his colleagues have led the development of several renewable energy projects on brownfields and industrial sites, including the Steel Winds facility, the Greenfield Solar Farm, and others. Next slide. So the state fiscal year 2021 enacted budget includes the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefits Act, which will help accelerate the progress towards the state mandate to obtain 70% of the state's electricity from renewable energy sources by 2030. Next slide. This comprehensive legislation includes three major components: development of a new Office of Renewable Energy Siting, the development of the Clean Energy Resources Development and Incentives Program, which we call the Build Ready Program, and the implementation of a state power grid study and program. Next slide. So a little more on the Build Ready Program. The Build Ready Program will be administered by NYSERDA, essentially putting NYSERDA in the role of the project developer, and is designed to advance a new model for development of renewable energy projects. Through this program, NYSERDA will identify potential renewable energy project sites, prioritizing the reuse of abandoned commercial sites, brownfields, landfills, former industrial sites, and otherwise underutilized sites. Eventually, fully permitted sites, including any negotiated host community agreements, will be auctioned off to private developers to build. NYSERDA will work closely with local governments to ensure that these projects are designed to deliver benefits to those communities. So with this background on the current policy updates, I will now turn the presentation over to Kathy Spencer from Labella, who will speak more in detail about what is going on across the state. Kathy?
Thank you, Jennifer. That was a great overview that launches me right into my portion of the presentation. So we can go to the next slide. So basically, I wanted to just start with an overview, but I know time is going to be of the essence because we have 5 or 4 other panelists following me. So I'm going to talk rather quickly through my slides. But of the 3 components that Jennifer mentioned, I'm basically going to be talking about the new siting and approval process under the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, or ORES, as some of us call it. And I'm also going to talk about the Build Ready program a little bit further down in my presentation. With regard to the Accelerated Renewable Energy and Community Benefit Act, many of us in the industry are calling it Section 94C. It is a new legislation under executive law entitled 94C, and it is a replacement of what many of us are familiar with under public service law, Article 10. Next slide is fine. So there's a tall order before the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, and that is 3 activities that need to be done within a year's framework. And that the act was passed in April 2020. A year time frame was set up to establish ORES and appoint an executive director. Second on the list is to get the regulations in place in order to implement the project or implement the 94C program. And thirdly, uniform standards and conditions for different types of renewable energy projects need to be established. Like I said, it's going to be a challenge to do all that in a year, but we're all interested to see how some of these things come about. Next slide. So with regard to implementation and the regulations, right now we don't have anything to react to. So really there's more questions than answers. We've been led to believe through the language in the law and other documentation that the regulations will be similar to what we know under Article 10, and the content of an application will be similar to what we've learned to expect under Article 10. So for any of you that don't know, the Article 10 regulations are a siting and approval process for utility scale or large scale renewable energy projects. And under Article 10, the defining threshold was 25 megawatts. What we are seeing under Section 94C is that threshold has an optional lowering point where projects that are 20 megawatts and larger can opt into siting and approval under 94C instead of going through the Article 10 process. The overall state purpose, we believe, in replacing Article 10 with 94C is to expedite the siting and approval process, which has proven to take many years under Article 10. So all of us who have been involved with Article 10 projects and the siting and approval of large-scale renewable energy projects are very interested to see how these regulations will compare. Under Article 10, there's 41 exhibits. Many environmental issues have their own exhibit number. So the question is, will under 94C those same exhibit structure stand, or will be replaced with one where environmental issues are recombined or de-emphasized or maybe dismissed altogether? So that's what we're watching for when the regulations do come out. Next slide. Another very important point to know about the 94C replacement of Article 10, which will be a big deal for renewable energy developers, is that there will be a set of uniform standard and conditions applied right up front to all of these large-scale renewable energy projects. So under Article 10, we basically spent the last 5 to 10 years negotiating such conditions on a site-specific basis for each project individually. The standards and conditions apply to all the way from siting through design, construction, and operation. So what will now happen is that we believe a lot of the negotiated standards that have been hammered out through the Article 10 process and maybe the consensuses that have been achieved, they will feed into this uniform standard and conditions protocol that will be developed. And it's the same list of agencies working on those uniform standards and conditions as were involved in Article 10. The difference is once those uniform standards and conditions are established, then most of the agency involvement goes away except for DEC. Just to point out, my last bullet there, we'll get our first look at these uniform standards and conditions, and 4 public hearings will be held across the state to gather comments. So we'll be looking forward to that. Next slide, please. What will happen for the projects, the different process under 94C will be an application is submitted, the uniform standards are applied, and any remaining site-specific environmental issues or other build issues will then be identified by ORES with DEC, and a set of site-specific permit conditions will then be negotiated with the possibility of adjudicatory hearings, which is a big part of Article 10. Next slide, please. So I have some timelines that will show you how the 94C process will proceed. But before we get there, there is a difference between projects that will be built on previously developed land in the timing than ones that are developed on greenfields. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Build Ready program. We at Labella consider this another tool in the toolbox for redeveloping landfills and brownfields and commercial industrial manufacturing sites. And we're really interested to see NYSERDA giving preference all the way down to otherwise underutilized sites. We'll be interested to see how broad an interpretation that is made in collecting those sites. So as Jennifer indicated, NYSERDA is going to identify sites across the state. They are going to do a initial suitability and critical issues analysis on those sites. They're going to get the sites through the permitting process, either through ORES if they're 20 to 25 megawatts and larger, or through seeker if they're smaller. And then they are going to bundle some incentives with those sites and have the competitive auction to developers. So I think developers should really keep an eye on this. And actually, you know, even beyond the build ready sites that NYSERDA comes up with, we at Labella are seeing some exciting opportunities in how to further identify additional sites and either take them through the shorter ORES 94C approval process or through seeker. So next slide, please. This shows you the permitting process timeline for renewable energy projects built on greenfields. You'll see that there's a 1-year maximum, that black line at the bottom. So once an application is deemed complete, there is a 1-year time frame that goes into effect. And what's very interesting is if ORES does not make a final decision by the end of that 1-year time frame, there is a default permit that goes into effect. Last slide, please. This just shows you the shorter timeline for projects that are sited on existing or abandoned properties. And you can see that a whole 6 months is pulled out of the longer time frame we just looked at. Again, at the end of 6 months, once a application had been deemed complete, there is a default permit that would be issued even without a final decision from ORES. That was a really quick overview. I will be participating in office hours later today, so I'm happy to answer any questions. But at this time, I'm going to pass along control of the webinar to Mark Reisler. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. There's a lot to dive into, so we'll get right to it. Next slide, please. Today, we're going to talk about financing solar projects. First, we're going to go through a brief description of the various sources of financing for projects. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the preparation for financing and how to prepare for a successful financing. Next slide, please. In terms of financing sources, the most common that we're going to talk about today are cash equity, tax equity, various forms of debt, securitizations, municipal bonds, and various government grant programs. Next slide, please. In terms of equity, well, if it's not debt, then it's equity. When we talk about equity, we're talking about investments to purchase stock or shares or partnership interests in an entity. And there are essentially two forms. One is cash equity, which, as like it says, is the injection of cash into a project. There are two primary sources of cash equity for these projects. The first is from the sponsor itself. sponsor or the developer is largely responsible for the project and acquires the project site or leases the project site, engages the various professionals from engineers to environmental consultants to contractors and other service providers, acquires the equipment to build the project, and may inject cash as well. In addition, all of the expenses, or most of the expenses, that the developer incurs in connection with developing the project is also recognized as a form of cash equity. Another source of cash equity is what they call private equity. You may have heard of private equity funds, which are largely pools of investments from independent investors that are made available to make cash investments into projects. Equity is important because it's required in order to attract debt financing. Debt financing is really just the injection of loans into a project in one way or another. And lenders or other debt investors are not going to invest in a project unless they know that there is equity in the form of cash or other non-debt investments in the project, so that they understand that the developers and the shareholders of the project have skin in the game and will be willing to take responsibility for the project because of their investment. Next slide, please. Another form of equity, and it's fairly complicated, so we'll just very, very quickly go through it, is what they call tax equity. And one of the features of renewable projects is that there are a number of federal and state and local tax incentives that have been made available in order to fund renewable energy projects. And in the case of solar, that is called the ITC, the investment tax credit. And that's a tax credit that is currently for projects commencing this year at 26%. It's winding down over the next few years. It'll wind down to 10% for commercial projects, actually 0 for residential. But fundamentally, what the tax credit is a credit towards taxes. So it doesn't have the effect of reducing taxable income. It has the effect of reducing taxes itself. So for people who have tax liability, entities that have tax liability, they can use the tax credit to reduce the amount of taxes that they have to pay. And so very often, developers don't have the actual tax liability or sufficient tax liability to take advantage of all of the tax credits. And so what do you do in order to monetize that value? Well, you can't sell the tax credits. You can't transfer the tax credits. So that's not a way that you can realize on the value of the tax credits. But what you can do, and what the IRS has issued guidance about, is you can create partnerships with investors and allocate through those partnerships the tax credits. And so that those investors are called tax equity investors, and they're investors with large tax appetites, significant taxes that they have to pay, and they will invest in projects in order to receive those tax credits, and their investments, the return on their investments will be analyzed taking into account, in addition to the value to them of those tax credits. Next slide, please. Then we have, after we're done with with equity, we have debt investors. And debt, as I said, is essentially one way or another a loan that's made to a project. And it can be made at various levels within the project structure. But for purposes of this discussion, I think the most important point is where you have a tax equity investment, the debt has to be structured in a way that accommodates the needs of the tax equity investor. What I mean by that is that in these tax equity partnerships that are sanctioned by the IRS, there are various rules that have to be followed in order to facilitate the use of the tax credit and to allow the tax equity investor actually to keep the tax credit and use the tax credit. And one of the rules, for example, is that the assets of the project that support the tax credit cannot be disturbed. And what I mean by that is if you were a lender, for example, and you would ordinarily want to, if things go wrong, if you would ordinarily want to foreclose on that kind of a project, you can't do that with a tax equity investor because that interferes with their tax credits. So the debt just has to be structured in a way, and this is often called back leverage or holdco loans, in order to accommodate that. And those structures exist, and it is another way of financing projects. Next slide, please. Securitization is just another form of debt, but in securitizations, you take a pool of assets, and in this case, customer contracts, like say leases, for example, or loans used to purchase renewable energy equipment, solar panels, and you pool many of those contracts, and you use that pool to collateralize the issuance of bonds to investors, and the cash that those customer contracts throw off as customers pay under those customer contracts is then used to pay principal and interest on those bonds. This is primarily a structure that is used for residential solar, because in residential solar you have thousands and thousands of projects, and you can pool all of those projects together to create securitizations. The fact of these large pools actually lowers the risk relating to repayment of principal and interest on those bonds, and so these large pools are important. It's primarily used for residential solar, but there is a trend towards starting to use it for commercial projects as well. So that is another avenue that is available. Next slide, please. Municipal bonds may be another avenue for financing a project. If a project is sponsored or owned in one way or another by a municipality, municipal bonds may be available to fund that project. Even if a project is not owned by a municipality, there may still be the possibility of using municipal bonds as a funding source. Next slide, please. And then finally, government grants, state, local, federal grant programs are may be available for your project, and so that may be a source as well. Although to some extent grants are starting to go away, but there's still some programs that exist. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the preparation for financing, and the key here is that in all of these circumstances, the investor, whether it's an equity investor or a debt investor, is concerned about risk. These investments are evaluated in terms of what they call risk-adjusted return, which is largely just analyzing a return, taking into account the level of risk associated with that investment. So if you have two investments that have the same level of risk, two investments that have the same yield, that result in the same return, the investment with a lower risk is a better investment because you incurred less risk and received the same return as the higher risk investment. And so risk is everything. And in preparation for financing, what we're really talking about is different structures to mitigate all kinds of different risk. Next slide, please. And I've just listed a few of the risk mitigating activities that a project has to engage in, largely to address various types of risk, making sure that your permitting and your environmental reviews are done properly, addresses risk relating to the construction of the project so that an investor is comfortable that a project is going to get built on time and in accordance with spec. In addition, various warranties from equipment providers as well as contractors that warrant the performance of the equipment, as well as the build out of the equipment, that the equipment and the construction will be built to certain standards to produce certain level of energy. Same thing with operators. Operators often will warrant their services as well, so that there are assurances that the facility will be operated to meet certain requirements. And the requirements are largely dictated by the off-takers, essentially the purchasers of the energy. And so you, as a financing party, you want to make sure that there are sufficient markets for your energy. And one way to do that is to arrange contracts with off-takers to purchase that energy. The ideal way to address that risk is that the energy is purchased at certain fixed prices so that everybody understands the revenues that are going to be generated from the project. Next slide, please. So to conclude, clearly there are a lot of different sources for capital for solar projects. There are structuring issues that need to be addressed in order to meet the needs of various capital providers. That's particularly an issue when you have tax equity involved, and that developers need to take a number of steps to mitigate possible risk in order to have the best chance of attracting affordable financing. I will also be available this afternoon for office hours to go into this in any additional detail if people would like. But I thank you very much for listening. And now we're going to have a brief video.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. Okay, I'm going to pass it off to Mayor Aiello in just a moment, but I'm going to play another video now featuring Mayor Aiello and Paul Curran.
Okay, on three. 1, 2, 3. Clean renewable power created by the solar farm will produce enough energy in the first year to power 652 typical New York State residential homes.
Progress that they're making and all the projects that tie in together, but this one will certainly help sustain the future of Olean with the energy.
We do the things necessary with renewable energy as we keep moving forward and you transition. So I'm very proud to be here simply because every time I drive by 86 and think about it, I see the clock ticking and I know your guys' budget is getting a little bit less and less and getting some help.
The site we're on was part of the infrastructure for an oil refinery some 50, 60 years ago. And it's a site with an industrial footprint, which is a nice way of saying there's some pollution here. It also has electrical infrastructure, so it's got power lines that used to service the refinery. It's just a perfect site for solar because this land should not be reused for housing. So we did approach the city and we said we could put together a solar energy project of this sort. We explained to them that we'd be selling them the credits from here, not physically the electricity, but the electrical credits from renewable energy projects which are available in New York State. We were able to respond to their RFP and strike a deal, and today is really the start of a very long-term relationship from this site.
Okay, Mayor Aiello, you are on.
Thank you. I guess it's still morning. Good morning, everyone. Just to give you a brief background, the city of Olean is the largest community in Cattaraugus County. We're located about 72 miles south of Buffalo in the southwestern part of New York State. We're about 14,000 people, and we were very happy to become involved with BQ Energy on this project. It took from start to finish, as you're going to see according to the timeline here. It was just about almost 5 years from the time we started. Excuse me, almost 4 years from the time we started until we actually started receiving the net metering credits. So we had to deal with zoning permits. BQ Energy, they filed a application for the zoning permit. Letters from attorneys were sent to us for to use the subdivision of the property at 231 and 251 Homer Street. These were the former brownfield sites. We had a couple of them in the city of Olean, and there's another solar farm just to the west of the one that I'm talking about right now, where the city of Olean receives the net metering credits. That was also put up by BQ Energy at the local college, St. Bonaventure University, and Olean General Hospital. They received the net metering credits from that. But we had to also, as we move along here, we had public hearings. We had support from our director of DPW on this project. The project had to be moved to the Cattaraugus County Planning Board for their input into it, and our Common Council had to come up or sign a lease with BQ Energy in order for this to go. Our Planning Board had to approve the site plans and the special use permit. Next slide, please. So here we are at in 2016. The Planning Board was approached to give BQ Energy an extension for 6 months. Then the Common Council had to approve a lot line adjustment. The Common Council then approved they did approve the lot line adjustment. They were approached about it and then approved it. Request for an extension, another extension on the variance that was needed here. The Planning Board approved the 6 months extension. Then we had to enter into the pilot agreement, which was the pilot agreement was approved, and the company Homer a Day was established in here, and then the Cattaraugus County Industrial Development Agency executed the pilot agreement. And then in February 2018, another extension for variance was asked for and granted. Next slide, please. Thank you. Planning Board approved a 6 month extension. Olean's Solar Land LLC purchased 2 parcels from Homer a Day, and the process just continued to go on. Then the Secretary of State issued the certificate that they needed there. Photographs of the work starting on the solar farm were in the Times Herald. It was quite an article, and to show the community what was going on here. And we had additional photos were put in the local newspaper. The Olean Times Herald is the local newspaper. Sublease and amendments to the with the city were executed. And finally, in July of 2019, we had the ribbon cutting involving many of the local political figures. We had our Assemblyman Joe Giglio there. We had representatives from our Congressman Tom Reed's office, and also from Senator Young's office at the time. So we are very pleased to have put together this thing with BQ Energy. That we were approached by them, and actually it was a RFP process that we went through. But we're very pleased to have teamed up, and we now have a solar farm that we are the recipients. I believe in the first year we're seeing in the area of $35,000 to $40,000 in net metering credits, which ultimately helps our budget here in Olean, New York. Thank you. Oh, sorry. I have to pass this along to Noni Flynn, Yates County Administrator.
Thank you, Bill. I'm Noni Flynn, and I'm the Yates County Administrator, and Yates County is located in the beautiful Finger Lakes area in central New York. And I'm going to be speaking on how we turned two decades-long dead landfills into an environmentally friendly project for Yates County. And on the slide, you can see initially we started looking into this in September of 2015, and our buildings and grounds supervisor investigated the feasibility of solar panels on these two closed landfills. And in August of 2016, he presented to our legislature the various business models. However, our county attorney thought that we would not be able to do this because we're limited by New York State county municipal law to a lease of no longer than 5 years. So we thought this project was totally dead for our county. And then in July of last year, we started to think there has to be a way for this to be possible in this environment in New York State. So we started to look into ways in how we can make it happen instead of ways of how it cannot happen. So after delving into it further with our county attorney, we learned that by having a purchase power agreement with a vendor, we would be allowed to have a longer lease term. So we started to hit the ground running last summer, and we formed a committee, a solar committee, to look into this because a lot of us didn't have a lot of knowledge on this. So the committee was formed of myself, our buildings and grounds supervisor, and a couple of our legislators. So then in September of 2019, we were able to put together a request for proposals. We asked a lot of other municipalities what their request for proposals looked like. So we were able to put together a proposal, seeking proposals from other persons or firms for the installation and operation of solar arrays or solar farms on the county landfill properties by way of purchase power agreement and lease, wherein such purchase power agreement would effectuate the production of energy in connection with certain buildings and facilities owned by Yates County, and the county landfill properties would be leased in conjunction with this purchase power agreement. And we advertised this in all of our local newspapers and sent it out to 21 solar developers. Then in November of 2019, we received 6 responses back from our request for proposals. The solar committee then reviewed these 6 proposals and came up with the top 3. And we asked these top 3 firms to make a presentation to our solar committee. Then in January of this year, we had our supervisor perform reference checks on these top 3 vendors. And then we chose BQ Energy is our top vendor of choice. And we asked our county attorney to review their proposed agreement. We had our buildings and grounds supervisor look into other areas where they had built solar farms. Then in February of this year, our county attorney reviewed their agreement, made a few minor changes, nothing, I think Paul would say nothing major to their proposal. And we prepared a resolution to present to our legislature. Then in March of 2020 of this year, our supervisor of buildings and grounds presented to the Public Works Committee on the Solar Committee's proposal for solar development at the 2 closed landfills. And the legislature adopted a resolution authorizing our chairman to sign agreements concerning solar development on the inactive county landfills. And then it was signed in May of this year. And I can tell you, for county government, turning this around within 1 year is a record. And we pushed really hard to get this turned around within a year, but our legislature saw a lot of the benefits of this. So we ended up signing a 35-year land lease for 2 capped landfill properties that will allow for the installation of up to 37 megawatts of solar arrays on the surface of these closed landfills. And the projects could operate by the end of late next year, and combined would be among the largest installations of solar energy on landfill properties in New York State. And once this full build out of the projects is completed, Yates County will receive almost $200,000 in annual rent, plus additional benefits in reduced price electric power sales. So consequently, we ended up taking 2 unattractive dead landfill sites and turned it into a long-term, environmentally friendly project for our county. And it will bring not only economic but environmental benefits to our county for decades to come. And right now, with the state that our entire world is in, we really can benefit from this additional revenue, and our residents will benefit tremendously. And Paul from BQ Energy was kind enough to send me this slide of what hopefully our project will look like when it's completed at the end of next year. And now I will turn it over to Paul, and I can't thank him enough for working with Yates County on this project. Thank you, Paul.
Well, it's our pleasure completely. And yours will look a little bit bigger and better than that last slide, trust us. I loved what Noni said in there about how turning something of focusing on how it can happen versus how it cannot happen. And that's going to be a theme of what I'll talk about here. And I like to go last on these so I can kind of cover what it is that we might have missed throughout the whole thing. Very little was missed. The presentations were really excellent, but there is an important message of what we're going to go. And you can go to the next slide, Claire. What we're going to be doing over the next 8 or 9 years is really transforming how electricity is generated in New York State. The act that you all responded to the poll about and that Kathy talked about is specifying that 70% of the renewable of all energy in New York State will come from renewable sources in 9 years from now. That's an enormous change, and it's going to require that people do look at how to make things happen rather than how to stop things or the obstacles. We've been doing that for a long time. Shown here is kind of our resume and so forth, showing that that's a wind turbine we built in Lackawanna, New York, about a decade ago on an abandoned steel plant. We put up 14 of them out at that site. We focus. We're a small shop. We're based in the Hudson Valley. We've been in business for 18 years now. We focus on developing renewable projects, and mostly solar these days, exclusively on brownfields and landfills. So we get calls all the time from people that own a farm that they don't want to keep going with and so forth, and wouldn't you like to put up solar panels on that? And we turn them down. We really just want to focus on brownfields and landfills. We think that makes policy sense, and I'll share you some of the numbers as we go forward here. The next slide, please. Here's just a sample of some of the charts or the projects that we're working on right now. In operation, I chose 6 that were over there. Many of them are in New York, some are in other places. This idea of putting solar farms on brownfields and landfills, our first one was actually in Massachusetts about 8 or 9 years ago now. And it's really gotten to be very, very popular because, as Noni said, really from a point of view of a municipality or a county, you're getting some financial benefit. Depends on the size of the project and the location, of course. But what you're giving up is the surface of the dump. And I mean that literally. It's a property that really can't be used for other things, and it should be used for this. And that's what we're trying to do throughout the Northeast. And as you can see on the in development part of this chart, we're seeing a great deal of interest in other parts of the country as well. We'll be building 5 projects this year. You can see their locations. The Mount Kisco one in Westchester County started construction a week or two ago, right after the governor allowed construction activities to start in that area. Throughout, we'll see several other sites there that we'll be building this year. In development, Yates County, Noni just talked about. We have others. On this chart, there is a trend really that we're seeing larger sites become more available in the development side. It used to be we would look at a site of 2 or 3 megawatts, and we still do that. Obviously, the Milan site in New York is about that size. But we're also seeing larger properties, old brownfield sites, where the owners are realizing this just makes a lot of sense to be pursuing this kind of thing. Next one, Claire. So this is sort of why do we do this? When I say most states desire more solar, I think it's a fair statement nowadays that all states desire more solar. And I'll show you why in a second, but you know, it takes a little bit of land for this, 4 to 5 acres per megawatt. Somebody was asking me before about how much would that take? How much would a 20 megawatt project take? And it's about 100 acres, which is not an insignificant amount of land, especially if you're trying to be near a population center. People use electricity where they live, so you need to get electricity from where it's generated to where they live. And the most efficient thing, of course, is to generate it very close to where they live. Most municipalities have a landfill. New York City has several of them. Buffalo has several of them. And if we can generate the power in those municipalities, it saves on infrastructure with transmission lines quite a bit. So this has some strategic benefit to the utilities, and it has some strategic benefit to infrastructure development. Brownfields are located throughout. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The cost of solar, I'm not sure if you can see the bottom line, number 7 on here, but the cost of solar has dropped quite a bit. So if you look at the cost of generating power from a new power plant, solar and wind are really about as cheap as any other sources. All of them are more expensive than an old 30-year power plant that's been paid for long ago. But I think when you look at the cost of solar nowadays, it is dropping. And it will continue to drop, and it is already competitive with other sources. Next one, Claire. So here's some math, and this is an important chart. In New York State, the DEC says there's about 3,200 closed landfills in the state. There's also about 3,700 brownfields. There's a lot of properties which are in these categories. If I just take the average landfill of 20 acres, that says that just landfills, there's about 65,000 acres of landfills in New York State. Again, using that number 5 acres for a megawatt, that would say that if you turned all of that, ignore the brownfields, but all of the landfills, you get about 13,000 megawatts. About an hour ago, New York State was using 19,000 megawatts of power. Of that 19,000 megawatts, by the way, about 22% was coming from renewable sources. And of that 22%, 17% of that was coming from hydro. About 1% of that 22,000 megawatts, or that 19,000 megawatts, was coming from solar. So it's still a very small amount. And if you just hold those numbers that I just said, that there's about 22% coming from renewable sources in total, of which 17 is really stuff that was built decades ago, hydro plants, that type of thing. That means that we have to get to 70%, mostly on wind and solar, which currently produce somewhere between 5 and 10%, depending upon how much wind there is that day. So we're going to take basically adding 50% of the New York State grid from a source which is currently making up about 5%. Really using brownfields and landfills, using a lot of different sources, is really going back to what Noni said before. We're going to have to look and see what we can do and not dwell on what we can't do. And that's why what Jennifer is doing at NYSERDA is so important. Not every brownfield or landfill can be turned into a solar farm, but we're going to have to look at those, like at Yates County, and say, okay, how do we make this happen? And what do we have to do to make the rules and the needs kind of jive in terms of where we're going to go in the future? The next one, Claire. So what does a commercial deal look like? And this gets back to what Mark was talking about before. First off, we're a developer. What we do is we go out looking for these sites. We've got a bunch of sites that are beginning, a bunch of sites in construction, et cetera. and a bunch in operation, we go look for very long leases. And the reason for that is solar projects have a construction cost that is significant and very little operating costs. So what you're trying to do is to stretch that construction cost over as long a period of time as you can, to amortize that cost of construction as long as you can, so that the cost of each kilowatt hour is reduced as much as it can be. The developer will pay rent to the site owner, typically fixed in the lease. At construction, the developer also takes over vegetation maintenance. When we started this, we had no idea that that was a pretty attractive thing to many communities, that mowing the lawn literally at their landfill is an expensive proposition for municipalities and counties. So us taking it over made a lot of sense, and it gave an extra benefit to a number of these communities. We pay for all the permits, we do all the studies, we get all the electrical interconnection permits with all the utility studies. This can take a while. I was flinching when Mayor Aiello went through the timeline of how long it took to go through the process with National Grid. But it does take a little bit of time depending upon where you are. We wind up owning the project and selling the power to whomever. There are different financing methods. At the project in Olean, we used M&T Bank and came up with a way that we could do that where they were getting the tax benefits that Mark alluded to quite a bit. The long-term owners of these projects really would like to be, pension funds that need fixed incomes or municipalities, but those entities cannot use tax credits. So we take a lot of time to try to figure out how do we best do these structures to make sure that things are done well and that they last for, again, at least 25 to 30 years. The last chart we have is a picture of what Mayor Aiello showed before. Claire, if you want to flip to that. Thank you. And this is, of course, the Olean project that you saw in the video before. It's generating power. It has been for a little over a year now. That's through 86 on the right. This is a project that will sit there forever, really having no impact on the environment, and the community welcomes this. As Mayor Aiello mentioned, on the other side of 86, just about where the drone is sitting right now, there's also a number of other solar projects that we generated on the old refinery site. So by using these old brownfields and landfills, we've been able to really bring land that had no alternate use back to productive benefit to the community. And we think that this makes a lot of sense in a lot of communities throughout New York State. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jennifer and we can go into questions.
Thanks, Paul. That was super helpful. Okay, so great. Before we move to Q&A, NYSERDA has a few resources we'd like to share with everyone. So if you're interested in learning more about NYSERDA's Build Ready program or free technical assistance for local governments offered by NYSERDA's Clean Energy Siting team, we've provided a web link and email address for each here. You can access the slide deck directly in the handouts section of the webinar dashboard so that you can access the web links that I've provided here. The slide deck also includes a link to join us during office hours later today, just a reminder. So we will now take questions from the audience using the question feature. So to ask a question, you can type in the lower box of your dashboard. All participants will see it, or you can mark it and send it to the moderators only. So I see we have one question here so far, and Noni, this one's for you. If Yates County did not own the project, is it subject to property taxes, the improvements being real property owned by a private company? Do you have any thoughts on that one, Noni?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, absolutely. If Yates County did not own the project, is it subject to property taxes, the improvements being real property owned by a private company?
Yates County still owns the land, but we're, I believe BQ Energy will enter into a pilot program for the taxes on that. So we will get some revenue from that as well.
That's correct.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Paul. So it's our first one, so I wasn't real sure.
Okay, great.
Sorry to interrupt you, Jennifer. All panels can turn their cameras now on at this point for the discussion portion. So that'll be 6 cameras on, and I will stop sharing my screen now. Please go ahead, Jennifer. Sorry about that.
No, great. Thank you, Claire. I'm actually waiting for more questions to come in. That was the only one that we've received so far. So if you do have a question, please enter it directly in your dashboard here, and we'll ask the panel.
Could I ask a question of Paul?
Yeah, that would be great.
Paul, I follow this solar, of course, so closely because it really interests me. And this isn't just a question I've personally been wondering about. When you say, you know, the solar panels will be there forever, which I know you don't mean forever, but 25 to 35 years, what do you think about with the pace of the technology improvements over the last 10 years? Do you think at end of life for these solar farms, we may have a whole different method of collecting solar energy and transmitting or distributing it in the grid?
Well, I almost do mean forever. The very first solar panels ever made were made in the 1950s in New Jersey at the Bell Labs. Those panels made in the 1950s are still operating on the roof of the Boston Museum of Science. We don't know how long these last. There's no moving parts. But I do say that generally speaking, that once you've installed these panels, they take no fuel. They take very little operating costs, only mowing the lawn, literally. So it would be surprising to me if you tore out these panels and replaced them with newer and different ones. Noni's landfills are lovely, but to be honest with you, there's lots more of them around the state. So when you take the cost of land, it doesn't make much sense to rip them out from Noni's landfills and put some more in on a landfill that Mayor Aiello may own down in Olean. So I think that these panels, unlike a wind farm, which has rotating parts, and you do need to maintain them and you do need to replace them over time, my belief is that solar farms will last far more than the 25 years that we're talking about. And at the end of the lease, we'll be talking about how to extend them.
Interesting, yeah.
Thanks, Paul. We actually have another question that just came in for you. What are the key factors you consider when evaluating a brownfield?
Sure. First off, it needs to be in a stable state as far as the DEC cleanup is concerned. So, you know, we're not there to clean up a brownfield. We're there to use a brownfield which has been remediated, or in the case of Olean or Yates County, a landfill which has been properly closed. You know, what we're looking for is size. You know, if they have a 1 acre landfill, that's probably too small for us to be doing very much with. And we need somewhat of a terrain which is flat. Oftentimes landfills are built in a conical shape, and that's really not very conducive to being used for solar. And the third thing that we're looking for is, of course, a power line nearby. We need to interconnect to the grid, and so we'll do a lot of work to look for what can we do. Mayor Aiello's sites were excellent that way because, you know, in a former life, electricity was used heavily by their refineries, so they had good power infrastructure in the area.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Okay, our next question. Any guess on when we will see regulations and standard conditions for the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act? I think I can answer that one. I believe from the time the act was put out in April, there's a year period in which the standard and conditions for permit approval have to be completed. Does anyone have anything to add on that piece? Okay, great. Kathy, this one's for you. In what ways will the implementation of the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act expedite siting and approval of renewable energy projects? I think you touched on this a bit in your presentation, but
yes.
Maybe you can add to that. Yeah.
Yes. Well, anyone who's been through Article 10 or have followed the progress through the Department of Public Services website will know that so far, I think there's about 6 or 7 wind projects only that have been approved since 2012. One of the most advanced solar projects is getting close, but none of them have been built. So with the Section 94C or the the act, as we are calling it, a whole first part of the Article 10 process has been lopped off. Basically, under Article 10, there's a public information program that takes at least 6 to 8 months to get through, where there's not much happening. And then there's an entire phase called the pre-application phase, where you go through stipulations discussions and a preliminary scoping, and you try to put together an agreement of what will be in the application. That phase has also been locked off from the approval process. So now we jump right to an application being approved, and then that year time frame or the 6-month time frame comes in. And I think it'll be really interesting to watch how these default permits work, because if there's hearings or if there's public opposition, there's really not a lot of room in the process to take that into account. You got the year or the 6-month time frame, and then default permit goes into play. The scope of municipal comments is also much narrower than it used to be. So that's we're thinking that instead of 3 to 5 to 8 years, some of these projects will be approved in a year to a year and a half.
Thanks, Kathy. And kind of going along with that, we received another question while you were speaking. Folks are curious how the new Siting Act will impact public participation, both in municipalities and for local residents in the siting process, and how that differs from Article 10. Can you speak to that?
Yes. So it's going to be a quite different process. With regard to municipalities, under Article 10, they were involved in every step of the way. Input was taken, and it was taken seriously by the siting board. They were able to comment on a very broad range of issues, including community character, visual resources, noise were usually some of the big ones that came into play. From what I'm reading and what we're seeing at Labella, it appears that the municipalities will now be invited to comment after the uniform conditions are generated, and they will only be invited to comment on compliance with local law. So their wide range of issues that they could comment on has, really been narrowed to the issue of local law compliance. So it would depend on what their local laws are like to see how broad they can get their commentary across. Public interest groups, there will still be intervenor funding under 94C. It's the same as the application phase for Article 10, $1,000 per megawatt. And that funding will be available to both municipalities and public interest groups. And it will be during the hearing phase or the issue identification phase after uniform conditions are generated where that will come into play. But it's a little difficult to tell without regulations how exactly that's going to be managed.
Great answer. Thank you, Kathy. We're going to go to one last question before we turn back to Claire to wrap up. Paul, this one's for you. It's a two-parter. Someone's curious about the minimum size brownfield or landfill site that's economically feasible for solar. And is there a certain amount of time a landfill needs to be closed before you can develop on it?
Sure. The minimum size, the Mount Kisco project is a little under 1 megawatt. And we're going to be doing battery storage there as well, by the way, which will be our first battery storage solar project that we will own. So that's about as small as we would go, about 1 megawatt, which, 4 or 5 acres of land. The second question you were asking was?
Yeah, the second question was the amount of time that a landfill would need to be closed before you can start developing on it.
It's a great question. We see a lot of landfills closed in the 90s, which are now about 20 years old. That's great. We generally say about 10 years because we want the landfill to have settled. and basically as the major amount of decomposition of the waste to occur before we start building on it. We in the DEC would both prefer a landfill which is at least 10 years closed.
Thank you, Paul. That's good to know. So Claire, I'm going to turn it back to you. I think we've covered all of the questions that have come in, and thank you all again.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. I think this has been a very productive and informative and very interesting webinar. It is our last webinar in the summit of our series of 3. Now, I do want to go ahead and share my screen and remind you of office hours this afternoon, because we're going to be talking quite a bit more about renewable energy in New York. And it's all things green, renewable energy, soil remediation strategies, open spaces, and more, featuring Labella, Sive Paget-Reisel, BQ Energy, NYSERDA, and Nav Shah. So again, this PowerPoint is in your handout section of your dashboard. So if you download this, the link's right there. And I do encourage you to also join us for our last session of office hours, which are on Friday. And that's on funding and money, something that we really do care about in this industry because it's how we move our projects forward in many cases. So don't miss out on that. And the last thing, I just want to mention the Summit LinkedIn group. Please put your thoughts there. Continue the conversation, reach out to speakers. The speakers are part of the Summit LinkedIn group, so they can address some of your questions there if you have more. And then also connect with your peers and share resources. It's an opportunity to do so, something that you can't necessarily do in person. So the link's right here, and then just click request access. And then finally, I hope that you do stay in touch with us. This is the contact information of SECLEAR's senior team. Again, I hope you continue with us throughout the rest of the summit. I hope you've enjoyed yourself so far. If you've missed anything, everything is being recorded. Just a reminder, the webinars are sent to you, to your inbox, about 4 hours after the broadcast ends, and all of the office hours are being posted in the LinkedIn group. You will also receive a follow-up email probably next week with all the links that you could possibly imagine. So look out for that. And with that, I will issue one more very hearty thank you to our wonderful panelists for their insights and their expertise. And I hope you all join us for office hours and connect with us later. Okay, everyone, have a really wonderful rest of your day, and we hope to see you again.